Welcome to another episode of the Major Outcomes podcast. Today we speak with Niels Rasmussen. Niels is a very inspirational leader with more than 25 years of top management, but also consulting experience, both in Europe and in the US. He also spent some time in Australia. He was, among many other engagements, a managing director at Hewitt Associates, but also an equity partner at KPMG. He's the founder of Plus Rasmussen, I think he's going to explain it a bit better, but I would say a boutique consulting firm, among other topics, working in the context of strategy and strategy execution, which we are going to talk about today. He's on many supervisory boards and advisory boards of both businesses, but also public institutions and organizations. And I think he says himself, he's a passionately Danish. So he's also serving Denmark as a diplomat, and a broad range of not just experiences, but also projects he's working on. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is the concept and the main topic of strategy development, more particularly participative strategy development, what that means, what his perspective is on that, and what kind of experience he has in that space. He works with his team with Fortune 500 companies, leading companies like Merck, several DAX companies here in Germany, but as I said, also public institutions like, for example, the city of Freiburg. So that's going to be a very colorful and inspiring session, I'm very sure. And with that, warm welcome, Niels. Hi.
Hi, Johannes, and thank you. And thanks for the warm welcome, and thanks for having me today. And yes, I'll just correct one thing. I was a diplomat in my youth, and now I am a goodwill ambassador for Copenhagen, which is an honorary kind of thing, but it unfortunately doesn't give me any red diplomatic passport or privileges anymore, but that was part of it. Perhaps also to Plus Rasmussen, as you said, we are a boutique consultancy. We are also a training academy. So some of the things we talk about today, we train extensively leaders and Allianz and large DAX organizations, as you said. But thank you again. Happy to be here.
Amazing. And sorry for that little thing. It's not on a regular basis that we have former diplomats on the podcast. So let's be precise here, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, then let's get into the topic. As I said, we're talking about participative strategy development, right? On the Major Outcomes podcast. We're all about the outcome economy, what this means for businesses, and everything around outcomes, right? Outcome-based strategic planning, outcome-based strategy execution. And I think if you really take outcome centricity or an outcome-based governance model in organizations seriously, it's also always participative. But to give this to you, what is participative strategy development? How would you describe this? And what does it mean? Why is it important?
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. That's a good first question. I think a lot of people battle with it. What is it, and what does it actually all involve and entail? And I think we'll get a bit later to what's included in it. I like to say that participative strategy development includes pretty much everyone, or as large a part of your organization as you probably can, and that it takes place before the transformation bells ring. We often hear about participative in transformations. We believe in the whole vision, the mission, the cultural, the whole aspects of actually setting the objectives for transformation takes place much earlier, and that you can engage pretty much 100% of your workforce. But just to counter that a bit, I'll share what we put it into ChatGPT, and they had a definition that's good. And there's only a little bit that we changed to it, but they say, a participative approach to strategy development and execution is a method of involving all relevant stakeholders in the process of creating, planning, and implementing a company's strategic goals. This approach encourages active engagement and input from employees, management, customers, and other stakeholders, rather than relying solely on the decisions and directives of a small group of leaders. We fully and entirely agree. Where we perhaps don't agree is involving all relevant stakeholders, because who decides who the relevant stakeholders are? If it is a CEO or a small group of leaders, oftentimes it isn't as participative as we believe it can be. So there is some stuff to that, yeah. But we really believe that you can have an entire organization, even large organizations, involved in shaping what we'll talk about, also the outcomes and the objectives of the organization. That's what we call participative strategy development.
So this is not just the first time with a former diplomat on the podcast, but also the first time a hybrid conversation with some AI that gives some of the answers at least as well.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
I like that.
I'm well prepared, right? Johannes, I'm well prepared.
Definitely, yeah. So maybe we can sort of like put that a little bit into contrast, right? So we talk about strategy development and strategy execution. This means how do we set a direction and how do we plan and prepare for organizational change. Your work is a lot about corporate development and change, which I think today every new strategy, every new major strategic initiative to some extent is. But why is the participative part different than companies might have done that in the past? Or what's the contrast? Why is it important, particularly now?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of stuff, and I'll get a bit to it again. I don't think it's just important now. I actually learned through hard experience myself when I became managing director and CEO of Hewitt's European region, so as a consulting firm with almost 1,000 people, that writing a strategy, the sort of famous telephone book, and then passing it on and giving it just didn't work. Not 10 and 20 years ago either. So it's about 15, 16 years ago that I experienced that. But this need has probably been, is increasingly now in exaggerated, basically because we have demographics that really drives it there. We have an aging workforce. We have 5 generations that you and I work with under our roofs. Yeah, we have a velocity of change that has a complex management an environment today that gets faster and faster in its pace and more complex. Now, I wouldn't trust myself, and certainly don't, as one leader or even a small group of leaders to have answers to all of these questions, neither for our customers or for the 5 generations that work even in our small company. So that's a key critical macro topic that's taking place around us. The other thing is we've done a lot of research on this, in particular on, there's not so much in terms of the success of participative strategy development. We're probably some of the few that really work it that way, but there's a lot of research on participation in transformations. And when we talk about enterprise transformations, for example, 2 researchers, Ramesh and Dalen, has shown that 70% of all enterprise transformations fail. 70%. That means, in essence, 70% of all the efforts, human capital, other resources that we put into it is wasted, basically, at the end of the day. Ramesh and Dillon says there's 4 factors that makes it either successful or not. It's timing, it's leadership involvement, psychological ownership, and transparency. Yeah, we can only agree with that. And I'll get to that a bit later in terms of how do we ensure that happening. But you already start realizing that if we want to cover these 4 success factors that I just mentioned, participation is obviously a huge benefit across the board in the organization as compared to the very few at the top defining all this, getting it right. Another article that we liked about a year and a half ago was in Harvard Business Review. It's McKinsey. They studied thousands of transformations, and they looked at these transformations, and they looked at the level of participation in the transformation. In essence, establishing that a minimum of 7% of the entire workforce population is required, or you will be faced with a negative total shareholder return. That was quite a milestone to see this. They've checked it. Not only that, this 7% is a minimum, but they also proved that the higher the participation, the higher total shareholder return. So in essence, the output or the outcomes of higher participation, you can literally correlate to the level of participation. And it showed that if you have 21 to 30% participation of your entire workforce, you reach up to about, I think it's 68% total shareholder return positive. That's, of course, a huge argument. Both of these points are a huge argument for involving as larger part. So those were some of the things that made us look at it more. Yeah.
Could you maybe, because there was a slight interruption, I'm not sure where the disconnect was, but could you maybe just really briefly quote that McKinsey study again? I think there might have been a couple of seconds where I lost your audio.
Yeah, sure. The Harvard Business Review, I believe it was in August or September, I think 21, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure. And it looks at the benefit of participation in transformation. So they looked at thousands, all types of not just enterprise transformations, and in essence showed that 7% is sort of the bare minimum of participation of your entire workforce. And if you have less than that, then you will experience negative up till, I think it's about 18% negative total shareholder return. And with the increased participation, you also experience an equivalent or even much higher increase in total shareholder returns. So from August, September, I believe, 2021.
Okay, then we're definitely going to put that into the show notes. I think you're also quoting that study in one of your white papers or one of the recent articles that you've worked on. So everything in that context, as always, you can find in the show notes to this episode. So we talked a little bit about why is participative strategy development and strategy execution so important. You say, as I understand you, at least, it's like this has always been important, right? The environment of the organization, the business of the organization is probably too complex. There's too much going on that you just should or could trust a small group of people really setting the course. So it's about getting all the insights, getting everything you need to know into the room when planning. I think, of course, it's something where the pressure, the pain increases the more complex things get, the higher the frequency of change, the more complexity you have in your environment, the more you depend on a more decentralized approach, you could maybe say, where everyone, and particularly frontline employees, teams who are really close to the customer, can also give input and are part of that process, right? So when we talk about outcome-based planning, outcome-based strategy execution, if you really take it seriously, business outcomes, customer outcomes, you realize that the kind of insights you need for that planning, right? Who is the customer? What is the value for the customer? What's the differentiated, distinguished, unique value we can create? That's not something that you can just base on some research, some management consultancy, some external partners, and a small group of people. It probably has to become more decentralized and also more continuous. Yeah, and I like what you hinted at, right? Also with one of the studies, timing is one important thing, not just timing overall, but I think also speed. Yeah, something we experience a lot working with larger organizations in the context of strategy execution is you set the course, you develop a strategy, and it's not just not so participative, but also until it trickles down into the actual execution layers, into the more operative part of the organization, it's already outdated. So you not just have no ownership, poor quality in terms of direction and really the right kind of outcomes, but also until people begin to understand and until it reaches them, it should already be updated and upgraded again because things have changed. So I think there's another interesting perspective on why participative strategy development and execution is so important. And I think one realization when you talked from me was that strategy development and strategy execution, those things sort of like are fluid, right? It's not like, okay, now the development is over, now let's go into execution, but it's actually ongoing development. One of I think the previous guest said it's today strategic thinking is so important, right? A 5-year strategy loses its value and impact in a faster and faster moving world. But strategic thinking in all parts of the organization is absolutely crucial. And that's for me what you describe when you talk about participative strategy development. I really like that. I think it's a really compelling idea and concept.
Absolutely.
Maybe examples. So challenges. Why is that so difficult? Yeah, we wouldn't talk about this. It wouldn't be a thing. It wouldn't be a term if it would be easy and if all organizations would be just doing it. So I think org structures is a thing, culture is a thing. Like, why is it so challenging to actually move towards a more participative strategy development and execution process, which, as you quoted, definitely is better for the business, right? It's not a nice to have, it's relevant for the business.
Yeah, and I believe it's an absolute must for those who are going to be successful today. So I could not agree more with your points, and also what you said before. Of course, fits with the Ramesh and Dalen. If anybody wants to read that was a white paper in the Journal of Enterprise Transformation. So that's quite a scientific piece, but of course it talks about the transparency and also psychological ownership of these topics, for the transformation really to work. So entirely with you. If you look at some of the challenges, you're absolutely right. We all speak to it. We all know it's right. The key in my view is literally, I call it the 1% of us. Yeah. So, and I, of course, as a founder and CEO of my own company, can easily fall into that trap. Yet for me, it's of course somewhat different. But if you take a paid manager in a traditional structure, centralized, I've grown up and I get paid the higher up in this hierarchical ladder I get, and my box in the centralized structure, the more power and the more control I have is in essence how I've been paid. Now that would in essence mean it's a humongous change also. And you're telling me, well, even if you're up there, I no longer believe that you know it all and can do it all. So what does that do to us as individuals, as leaders, which is also what we talk about when we talk about psychological safety in the environment when you do this? So that's a huge thing. And it's actually totally, whether you're in Denmark or you're in Germany, we all have these fears of losing out if we don't help at least to say, well, what is the alternative? Where does it look? And that, I think, creates a huge challenge, a huge barrier. When we draw a lot of what you and I talk about, these organizations that are less centralized, less decentralized, a lot of transparency, but there isn't always the same kind of level of control, etc. And how do we feel with that? Particularly if we are older, if you're in your 50s, as I am as an example, and you're moving towards where do you want to retire, all this kind of thing. So there's a lot of that. That is also a culture that then quickly we are in a small leadership group. We decide to rather to stay in that little tribe as compared to giving the larger organization the freedom to try things out, to fail faster. I wouldn't even say just to learn faster, really fail faster, because that's how we learn the best. So I think that's a huge topic. The other topic that I think the first one is the course of the second is that we don't allow or don't trust or believe in a true ownership culture. So when you talk about strategy development and that these things have to happen much faster, funny enough, we have, and so do our partners at Danish Design Center who we work with, they do a lot of experimenting around this as they focus a lot on organizational designs these days and societal designs. We believe that you can trust everybody to lead. But that's quite a provocative notion. But if you follow that, as compared to, I call it the 1% that's fearful of losing their power perhaps, or their seat and their control because they think that goes against them. Those are big challenges to overcome. Yet we do know, and there's a lot of research that points towards this, that we all want value-based jobs and activities. We call them outcome-driven activities as well, away from the output. And so I think those are key topics that are in the way yet. And of course, I think the biggest challenge that we have is not so much this fear, but it is what happens to me then. And I really believe that's also why we still have a lot of decentralized, I call them traditional, old-fashioned structures instead of meaningful. Some is traditional, some is perhaps agile, some is hybrid, perhaps some is even self-leading, etc. Some of the things that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. That makes tons of sense. I think you're literally saying this is a redefinition, or at least an extended definition of what leadership means, right? If your job that you deserved yourself climbing up the corporate hierarchy is not to be right anymore, but to establish the kind of processes, the setups to make sure the right information, the people with the right information get together, and together you're developing the right picture, the right course. That requires different kinds of skills, different culture, different level of trust, and a new idea of what a leader and a manager is in that context. So that's definitely one of the biggest bottlenecks or hurdles in those kind of changes when companies we also at WorkPath work with trying to move to a more outcome-based governance model, a more outcome-based strategic planning and execution model. So that takes time for sure. If you've been operating in different mode for 50 years, 60 years, hundreds of years sometimes, this will not be achieved in just 2 or 3 years. You'll make immediate progress, I think that's clear, but it takes time. Okay, so...
Yeah. And perhaps I can just quickly add to that, because I think one of the things we developed a number of years ago, and that's also in line with why we have an academy, in leadership development. Traditionally, we were taught basically that good leaders know how to lead others, right? That's sort of the traditional notion. The last 10, 20 years, we've understood we should lead ourselves better too, in terms of health and well-being as well. But the being led is a relatively new field. What does it mean to be led by other generations in the organization? It's a huge barrier and challenge, basically. So just to add to what you just shared, we really need to work with the leaders of organizations. It isn't just as simple as we just provide a new agile design and then expect things to work. In essence, there's every guarantee that they want. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I like to not underestimate that component, right? You can have an organizational, a systemic view on those kind of things, but it's also a very personal thing. You talk about different generations, and I think it's kind of a cliche that only the younger generations want outcome-based jobs and value jobs where they know what they contribute and what kind of value they can bring to a customer. But yes, different generations and then people who've been successful based on different kind of principles now suddenly having to adjust. It is a very personal challenge or a people challenge in that context. So I think it's good to emphasize that. So as we're going back to, and I think organizational development, corporate development always is both systemic, but also about people change. I think we touched upon it a little bit already. The corporate development function, but also corporate and organizational development, driven by leading consultancies, strategy consultants, and these. Why is that becoming more and more important in that context? Yeah, I mean, obviously organizational development is not a new thing, but I think the way we talked the first couple of minutes, you get an idea that organizational development plays a much bigger role than it used to in the context of strategic planning and execution.
Yeah. So we even see it with some of the, and I'm not going to name any consultancies here, but some of the very esteemed consultancies have also over the years developed what they sometimes a bit derogatory called implementation consulting, and with lower fees. We see that as an absolutely misnomer. But really, there's a bunch of things that OD, organizational development practitioners, bring to this. I mean, there's, of course, a whole study of organizations. What's a fit organization? There's a lot of stuff in it. And I think one of the things I've heard from you at some point in time, Johannes, is that we talk about strategy being replicable. Yeah, so I could in essence even write up and say, ChatGPT, write me a strategy for my consulting business. And maybe I'd end up with the telephone book I used to get in the past that tells everybody what to do, how to structure the business, and the consultants are out of there. And this is probably also why a bunch of transformations, in particular those tied to strategy, fail. So absolutely. Some of the skills, of course, that OD brings is that they are oftentimes, or most of the time, many of them certainly organizational psychologists as well, so they understand what impact it has when we change on both leaders, on individuals, on groups. They've learned in many ways to analyze and diagnose signals in the different ways. Some of them are clinical psychologists, and so when we get into things such as coaching and training, etc., and working with people that are leaders, current leaders, past leaders, new leaders. How do we deal with this whole change? And I call this sort of resistance element, because it is exactly as you say, all generations want to have a value based. Pretty much, it's not a generational thing. I'm 57 almost, and I'm at the end of this kind of spectrum. I want outcome and not output job, even in my organization today. So I think the barrier is much more lies with what we call oftentimes a bit with a smile on our face, the 1%. Yeah, and these are the 1% that pretty much knows that yes, the change impacts them more than others, and they feel threatened because of loss of control and power, etc. But you will be surprised to learn that pretty much in the participative, you will find that 99, and oftentimes in large organizations, 99.9% of the population, of the employee population, agrees and sees similar things around the timing and the vision and the goals and what we would like to achieve and what we'd like to do and why we're here. So sort of the outcome of all these actions, so to speak. So this is a big part of why I think OD has taken an absolutely more and more and will continue to take a more and more critical role.
So both, I think, right? What I take from your work and some of the work I've read from you as well is like that. On the one hand, OD is much more important today, sitting at the table when strategy is being developed and executed all the time as a function, but at the same time also as a skill, as a certain way of thinking. It has to be a bigger part of the toolbox of every responsible manager and leader, right? It's I think that's something we talk a lot about on the Major Outcomes podcast and with our customers, our partners, is how important it is for managers to work on the system even more than in the system. Not just, and I think it's just a different way of saying what you just said a minute ago. Strategy itself, at least parts of it, might be a bit more, I don't know, arbitrary or this is not that makes you unique alone. It's also how does this system around look like? How does the organization look like? How is it built? How is its capability to continuously adjust to the strategy? In the end, strategy execution and your strategy execution capabilities are probably the more important competitive edge in today's world than just the strategy itself. So I really like that perspective. Maybe to get even more hands-on, we can sort of like move towards your approach and how you've seen companies winning with these endeavors. We talked a little bit about the role of corporate development, OD, and what you've been doing there, what you've been experiencing there in that context. Can you maybe give us some more context or some more insights? How do you work? How do you basically help companies implementing more participative strategy development and execution processes? I think it's important to say you're doing both, right? Analysis, diagnosis, but also then the testing, restructuring up to the execution. So let's spend a couple of minutes on your way of working there and hopefully some tangible best practices we can share with the audience.
Yeah, happy to do so. And I think a first part of this also that you shared before, Johannes, is that this is continuous. So I hope what I share now too will help realize why the organizational development function and what we often install within is called the strategy management function to really help guide and track this, because it doesn't happen by itself. So the absolute first thing, so you know that we are writing an article on some of those topics. We'll publish a white paper that might eventually become a book, because it is a rather heavy topic which people don't typically appreciate and understand. When we talk about participative strategy development and execution, we have 12 steps, and I'm not going to go through them all because that would bore your listeners to death before I'm done. But there is a bunch of stuff that is very traditional in there, such as a briefing. But there is, of course, always difference in terms of how do we do it. What is it we listen out for in a briefing? And if you talk about, for example, just the analysis and diagnosis piece, everybody's going to say, yeah, well, we do that too, and we did that. But it's, of course, in how you do it, right? So in a traditional, you might do very external focused, what a competitor is doing. You might look at historic, you might even look at engagement and other stuff and say, so how fit are we and what do others do? And the participative, of course, both when we analyze and diagnose, there's a bunch of things that we do. Why? Again, we often like to have the psychological glasses on as well, but we interview, we look at focus groups, we interview potentially customers, even competitors when it's open, academics, very open-ended, so that we never ask a closed set of questions. We literally say, what could the world be if there was no barriers and limits, so to speak, etc. And we do that through the whole piece from vision, excuse me, to mission, to the strategic options that we have, to the structure that we want to work into, the roles, responsibilities. And one of the things that we look at this stage is we look to identify and recruit talent and ownership, and also for transparency. So those are some of the differences. Just if I talk about the difference between traditional and the what we call the PSD, Participative Strategy Development. It's such a long word, so PSD is for short. When we look at the organizational design, traditionally, and you'll know this as well, and this is why I hit before on the relevant stakeholders. If you do what we then term and decide relevant stakeholders, then we oftentimes sit with the same management board, the same people as what we had. Participative literally means everybody. It also means, and here's some cool stuff. This is from Roger Martin. He's a former dean of the Toronto Rutman School of Management. He says value-adding jobs, something we all aspire to today, as you said. And he basically says that all subordinates want to have a role in designing their boss's role too. And so I fully agree with that, because otherwise they vote with their feet at the end of the day. So again, when we think about the organizational design and structures, we don't just think about that. We also think about the roles, who's going to be in these roles, and we literally go, so very, very different to what the traditional way of doing it, and of course also what makes many people fearful. Danish Design Center, who works around these topics right now, have decided you select your leader. I believe that we will see much more of that going forward, meaning you have to create followership. That means around the results, the outcomes, all the things that you drive and lead. And I think that's a tremendous difference to the traditional piece. One final piece that I think but we have 12 steps and they're all very different to the traditional, but we also talk about the tracking and the execution, which is of course got to do with transparency. But even if we work with some things, it helps us do stuff way earlier in the process. And we give transparency not just to employees. In our case, for example, and we use OKR, as you know, and we use the methodologies. We also have that our board, so our advisory board, has access to our progress all along. So we don't have to wait for a quarterly board meeting to be told, okay, now we're looking at lagging indicators. No, they can tell us if they think, and these are some really smart guys that tells us, why aren't you guys doing this and that? We think that'll help you towards the outcomes that you are heading. Just as some examples, as I said, the 12 steps we will be publishing, and we'll definitely send it to you if there's interest in the listenership here. That both the article and the white paper, when it comes out, we'll be very happy to share that, because it gets into a lot of detail, and there is a certain amount of discipline necessitated. If you skip some of these steps and cut it short, I can also typically say it doesn't work, and we call that, oftentimes we hear back from clients who did it, the watermelon effect. It's green on the outside and deeply red on the inside. They say we are on a good way, but we all know that the full transparency can be followed, tracked using OKR methodology, for example. I find fabulous. I've had to learn a lot, and it really functions well in guiding you and keeping you disciplined around also executing.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, as you said, we shouldn't fall into like all 12 steps because then we need probably the next 4 to 5 hours.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share some like case studies, examples also from your previous engagements where you, just to sort of like give some more color to what you just said? I think particularly in the context of organizational restructuring, I think you have quite a lot of experience. And Then I think the second topic we should also dive in a little bit more is how you set up those strategy offices, how you do that, the tracking and the execution, because I think that's quite an important part of your work.
Yeah, so we've got a bunch we literally insist on participative, otherwise we don't engage with clients, and it can start anywhere. It can start around strategy and vision. So we've had one client, for example, a national health insurance that basically knew that they were losing their independence unless they would continue to grow. So on the top line, they had to create a much larger members base, basically 25% growth over 5 years. Otherwise, they would at some point in time be swallowed up. At the same point of time, they were bloated and knew it, and demographics were also forcing them. And in essence, but with works councils, approval and full involvement in participative, so that's important as well. We don't choose just the ones. And interestingly enough, workers' councils, for those German listeners, are often extremely supportive of this whole process and work in it. They had to reduce also their workforce with close to about 30% over those same 5 years. So that's already something that will force you to write the telephone book, etc., and something that lends it extremely well to participative. As people also get choices, they can help with the designs, the transparency is there, there's no shock therapy, there's no strikes, and they're actually on a very good way on executing now a couple of years into their into this. So that really starts, that's a great example. We have it also at times where we have business units. So it isn't always just the entire enterprise, but we have business units. One, for example, that was a large global automotive. They develop, and I cannot get into too much detail because it's very confidential, but one of the leading technologies in mobility today. And in essence, are forced to literally deliver on two technical developments, and they have humongous brand names as clients in the automotive industry. I can share that much. And yet with the same amount of resources have to develop, so you can basically say double the speed, etc. Again, a place where we needed much more agility. So one can say the strategy is laid, so it's much more around how do we now structure? And that's, of course, one of the famous sayings is structure follows strategy. We fully agree with that, but we also believe that strategy follows a clear vision and clear outcomes and objectives. Where do we want to be? Based on that, we set the strategy participatively with, as I said, as many. And in all of these cases, we've been able to engage in the last 100% of their workforce. So in the first one, it was probably rather full participation through these steps, maybe 50, 60% of the workforce, but also in some cases on a voluntary basis. That's another thing. Participation isn't forced. And you might have organizations that say, look, I'm happy. I actually want early retirement. So for me, it's good if you guys help design this for me, etc. That was the case in the health insurance that we worked with. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for those examples. I think that's always highly appreciated by our listeners. And to give some more of this practical insights from your reality, from your day-to-day work. So I'm looking at the time, and we're already ending or closing, coming close to the end. Maybe one last question, because you just mentioned, right, defining outcomes, setting the right kind of objectives. And I know that you in your own company work with OKRs. I think you just completed your own vision and strategy process from another cycle in your company. And you mentioned it earlier that you work with OKRs with many of your customers, particularly, and I think that really makes you stand out against many others in that space, to get into the action part and into the transparent tracking and execution quite early. So it's not that you're developing a new strategy, dozens of slides and a new organizational design, and then you leave. But I think you're getting more hands-on quite early. So there's, of course, many OKR practitioners, many leaders who believe in outcome-based planning and collaboration here on our podcast. Maybe you can give some more context, some more details on how you work with OKRs or similar methodologies to get that into action and to make happen what I just described.
Yeah. So important to clients. I think you also asked about the value of the strategy management office. So OKRs, I believed always that I knew, and we were working towards OKR methodology. So here again, I have to be a bit honest and say I learned a lot from. I think two of my partners are now OKR masters, educated by your guys, and we also use the WorkPath as a platform. They are also trained the trainers. And that has helped me a lot because where I thought I was the expert, and obviously we've been using the similar methodology, a couple of things that have changed. It's really the discipline of truly doing OKR and looking at the objectives before you get into, which is a typical mistake, the key results or key initiatives and things. That has been extremely helpful for us to look at it in a much more disciplined. So a little bit is the same as with our 12-step approach. I think the approach to OKR has to be very disciplined, educated for it really truly to bring the full outcome value, if you will. That's a personal view. The other thing, of course, is the technology behind it, the platforms today, so the transparency that Dalen and Ramesh talk about, of course, and our board can see exactly where we are at any given time. Are we doing what we set out to do to meet these overall outcomes and the objectives we've set ourselves? Entirely different to just a few years ago when we used Excel spreadsheets and then had to share them, send them, email them, and hope people would read, et cetera, et cetera. So we use it a lot, but it is also a learning, and we had to learn, and I had to learn, and I'm being guided by my partners in this respect, but the whole organization at the same time gets to learn it, which is also important because we utilize it so much in our work. So all of the organization participates in this whole piece, as you said. Yeah.
And as you said,
so
I think
far
it's really not about just the documentation part and putting it somewhere, but how do you bring it to life, right? And both. Yeah. How do you not spend too long in planning and then think, okay, this is now a new phase. Now we get into execution, but you basically are in that constant mode of planning, execution, learning, adapting. So making this a living and breathing, a very dynamic system, I think that's what really is key. And we're at least some also, and I don't want to turn this into an advertisement podcast. I'm always emphasizing that, but we're for many companies, particularly for a bigger organization or have a large scale process, it makes sense to think beyond Excel and PowerPoint at some point. Yeah, but yeah, okay,
absolutely.
That makes tons of sense, and thanks for also the kind words about the training and the OKR masters. We're coming to an end, as I said. We always like to ask some questions, which are, again, going back to more like you as a person. What are you interested in? What are you reading right now? And what can you share with our audience? So maybe you can share some books that you recently read and that might be relevant to our audience.
Yeah, happy to. I'll share one that I really like in Denmark. It is in English, by the way. It's on the top 10 now, and it's from a good friend of ours that we work with as well, Christian Bason. He's the CEO of the Danish Design Center, and they talk a lot about design thinking in everything from societal to politics to business. I like that book a lot. Favorite book of mine, I got it from my former CFO 11, 12 years ago, is The 4-Hour Workweek. And I still believe, I haven't read the new editions, but I think it holds a lot of truths still in terms of how we work and operate and how sometimes we try to fill an 8-hour day. So that's one of mine.
Tim Ferriss, always a good go-to, yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely he has always a good new way of looking at things. So I like that a lot. Designing Your Work Life, there's a new edition by our two friends, Dave Evans and Bill Burnett at Stanford. We also work with them, but I like the Odyssey planning, continuing thinking about where do we want to be? So again, what's the outcome sort of our lives and our careers, if you will. So I find that's extremely helpful. And then I've just finished a book called Chip Wars, which I like, but that's a bit my history thing. I like to look at what did big strategic decisions in large organizations. I'm now on a new one, which is around the whole how did the private equity industry come around, Blackstone, BlackRock, all those kind of, but that goes a bit back to my passion, but it does help a lot to think about strategic choices and whether they're made by one or whether they're made by a large group in a continuous basis, which is what we're discussing here.
Yeah. Cool. And again, also here, we're going to put that these reading recommendations into the show notes. I won't ask you for favorite podcasts. I think in one of our previous conversations, you told me you basically are 5 minutes bike ride to work, so you don't listen to a lot of podcasts. You're more of a reader, so we skip that. How can people reach you?
I listen to yours, Johannes, so I can say that easily. Come on. I listen to yours, but that's about the...
We already had the advertisement part earlier, so... No, that's very kind. How can people reach you, Niels? Like when listeners want to find out more about you, how can they engage with you?
Yeah, I'm pretty open. I'm very available. I'm very Danish, easy to reach, very informal, as everybody testified to. LinkedIn is certainly always a good place to just start and shoot. And of course, our website, I know that we need to update something there, but that's also a good place just to see what we're thinking, doing, how we're working. And that probably is, in a month or two's time, going to be the best place to get a broader information on us as an organization and what we do and what we publish and write. So, but LinkedIn, always good. I'll make sure and I certainly respond to everything and look forward to hear from anybody who has an interest in this topic. Yeah.
Perfect. And then the last question, this podcast, Major Outcomes, is about the outcome economy. It's about outcome management. It's about leaders and experts like you who believe in a more outcome-centric working world. And still, everyone has a little bit of their own perspective to what outcome management and outcome-centered life means to them. So who are some particularly inspiring leaders or people that you would say represent that way of thinking, that philosophy, maybe even people that we could invite on that podcast?
Oh, that is a good question. Well, I definitely would think you could consider Christian Besson, who's, as I said, the CEO of Finnish Design Center. That could be quite interesting as an outcome base because they really focus on their organization and have changed it to a self-leading and are experimenting with that. And obviously the problematic is, again, as a history buff, there's a lot of folks, some passed away, like Steve Jobs, Churchill. I mean, when you consider their outcomes, and I believe they had a vision of these outcomes, those were the people I'd invite, but it's a bit difficult for you at this point in time. Valdemar Schmidt, another Danish CEO, used to be the CEO of ISS. Not a lot of people know that, but 500,000 people in that organization. He's a good friend again. Yes, you can invite my wife. I think she's very driven and outcome-oriented, but I hope those are some names. But I'll think about it too. Who else you can invite, Johannes, and I'll shoot you as I think about who are living and interesting folks that you can invite. Right now, those would be the quick... the ones that sort of quickly come to mind.
Perfect. And isn't there a better closing note than a nice shout out to your wife and probably a more realistic guest to the podcast also than Winston Churchill, though. But no, Niels, thank you very much. Thanks for those also very personal answers. And again, check out those show notes if you want some of those details and links that we talked about. This is it. That's it for today, Niels. It was a pleasure as always. I think there will be further conversation like this, and I wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Johannes. It was a great pleasure, and I look forward to next time.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe to the Major Outcomes podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other major platform you might be using. Also, we'd be excited if you'd leave us a review. This helps us grow the community and spread the outcome mindset. See you on the next episode.